Before Lake Lanier was a playground for millions, this was a town where black families built wealth, community, and a tragedy was buried instead. If you stand on the shoreline today, it's easy to believe the lake has always been here. The marinas, the houseboats, the sunscreen smell in July, the way the water reflects the sky like polished glass. But Lake Lanier is not an ancient place. It's a decision, a project, a line drawn on a map that turned farms, roads, churches, and graveyards into something that no longer has an address. And before the first gate closed, before the water rose, parts of what you're standing on were called Oscarville, a community in Forsyth County, Georgia, tied to a larger black presence in the county that would be systematically erased long before the lake existed. Most people hear Lake Lanier and think of drownings, boating accidents, and the modern reputation: dangerous, cursed, haunted. But the lake's story doesn't begin with water. It begins with who was allowed to live here and who was forced to leave. And once you see that clearly, the rest of this story stops feeling like random tragedy. It starts feeling like a pattern. In the early 1900s, Forsyth County had a black population measured in the thousands. Families who farmed, rented land, owned land, worked trades, raised children, built churches, and kept the community close. And then, in September 1912, something happened that changed the county's demographic reality for generations. Two separate alleged attacks on white women in the Cumming area ignited a wave of accusation, panic, and violence, events that quickly became the justification for collective punishment. One name matters here because it shows how quickly suspect became sentence. Rob Edwards, a black man in his 20s, was arrested as an alleged accomplice in the May Crow case. A mob formed. According to the Atlanta History Center's timeline, he was lynched, hanged from a telephone pole in downtown Cumming, and then shot repeatedly. That isn't a rumor. That's recorded history. And the violence did not stop with one body. Two other black men, Ernest Knox and Oscar Daniel, were convicted by all-white juries and executed. Events the Atlanta History Center documents as part of the same sequence that followed the May Crow case. Here's the part that usually gets minimized when people retell this. Even if you never read a single newspaper clipping, you can track what happened next through population changes and the documentation that survives. Because after the lynching and the trials came something worse than a single act of violence. It became a campaign. Bands of white vigilantes, often described in sources as night riders, began terrorizing black families across the county with threats, arson, and intimidation. Churches were burned, homes were attacked, families fled with what they could carry, and within weeks, black residents were leaving in droves. The New Georgia Encyclopedia describes it plainly. In 1912, white residents violently expelled all 1,098 black residents from Forsyth County, and the county became notorious for decades as a sundown community maintained through intimidation and violence. That number should sit heavy, because it means this wasn't one crime story. It was a removal, a cleansing, a county deciding, through force, who belonged on the land. And once land becomes abandoned under duress, history has a way of being rewritten as if it happened naturally, as if families simply moved away. But when people flee under threat, what they leave behind doesn't become ownerless. It becomes taken. It becomes inherited. It becomes profitable. Now hold that in your mind, because this is where Lake Lanier begins to form, not physically, but morally. Decades later, the US government moved forward with a massive reservoir project on the Chattahoochee River, built and operated by the US Army Corps of Engineers, with construction centered on Buford Dam. Lake Lanier, officially Lake Sidney Lanier, was created when Buford Dam was completed and the lake began filling in 1956. A lake doesn't appear, it consumes. The reservoir required land acquisitions and relocations across the valley. According to an official county overview, the creation of the lake involved moving hundreds of families, along with businesses, churches, and cemeteries. with figures commonly cited as 250 families, 15 businesses, 6 churches, and 20 cemeteries. Read that again. 20 cemeteries. 20 places where names were carved into stone, where families believed their dead were resting in a fixed place on Earth. But once a lake is planned, the dead become a logistical problem. Some remains were relocated. Records exist of cemeteries being moved to higher ground, a process that in itself can be messy, incomplete, and emotionally brutal for communities. And this is where Lake Lanier earns its strange, unsettled undercurrent. Because the reservoir didn't just flood trees and foundations, it flooded my memory. It submerged what was already hard to talk about. Oscarville, often described today as a ghost town beneath the lake, sits inside that larger story, a place tied to the 1912 expulsions, later absorbed into a federal project that physically erased the landscape. When people say, "There's a town under the water," they usually say it like a scary fun fact. But a drowned town isn't spooky, it's evidence. It's what happens when a place is emptied, then renamed, then repurposed, until the original residents exist only as whispers and footnotes. And here's the quiet detail that makes this chapter matter for everything that comes next. Lake Lanier's reputation for tragedy is often treated like a modern phenomenon. A dangerous lake, reckless weekends, bad luck. But the lake was built over land that had already been marked by displacement and violence, and then it was made to swallow the physical proof. Even major contemporary reporting connects the lake's haunted reputation to this documented past. Oscarville's erasure, Forsyth County's expulsion of black residents, and the submerging of structures and burial grounds beneath the reservoir. So when you hear people talk about curses and ghosts, understand what they're really doing. They're trying to describe something history already explains. A place can be dangerous without being supernatural. A place can feel wrong without being haunted. Sometimes the unease is just the human brain noticing what a community tried to cover up. If you grew up around Lake Lanier, you've heard the shoreline stories. You've heard someone say, "There are graves down there." You've heard someone else say, "They didn't move everybody." And maybe you've dismissed it as folklore. But the documented reality, relocated cemeteries, displaced communities, and a county reshaped by racial violence, isn't folklore. It's the foundation, and once you build a modern playground on top of a buried past, you don't erase the past, you just remove the warning signs. You make it easier for people to forget what the place is made of. And forgetting has consequences. Because within a decade of Lake Lanier beginning to fill, the lake started earning a second history. One written not in land deeds or court cases, but in missing persons reports and death totals. Not one freak accident, not two. A pattern. But within a decade of its completion, something unexpected began to emerge. A pattern no engineer predicted, and no one could fully explain. 700 deaths, and counting, all in the waters of a lake so popular that millions visit every year. But why are its waters so unforgiving? Lake Lanier doesn't look like a killer. That's the first problem. From a distance, it reads as summer, wide, bright water, boat wakes, families on docks, a horizon that feels safe because it feels familiar. And because it was built for people, it's easy to assume it behaves like a natural lake. But Lake Lanier is a man-made reservoir, a flooded landscape filled in the 1950s after Beaufort Dam was completed. The shape of the bottom is not smooth. It's not lakebed. It's land that was never meant to be underwater, which means danger here isn't always visible. Sometimes it's directly under your feet. Sometimes it's a decision you make because the surface looks calm. And sometimes it's a statistic so large you stop hearing it as human. The Guardian's reporting puts the lake's death toll at over 700 deaths since its creation in 1956, a number that keeps coming up because year after year the lake adds names. And before we go any further, I want to be clear about the tone of this chapter. No myths yet. No cursed water, just what can be verified, what the numbers say, what the incident reports show, and what the patterns reveal when you stop treating each tragedy as a one-off. Because if you're trying to understand why a place keeps taking people, you don't start with ghost stories. You start with the record. There's a way people talk about Lake Lanier that sounds almost defensive. They'll say, millions go every year. If it was truly dangerous, everybody would know. But that's the trick of big numbers. Lake Lanier is one of the most visited lakes in the region, commonly reported in the range of 10+ million visitors annually, depending on the source and year. When a place has that much traffic, tragedy doesn't look like tragedy at first. It looks like incidents. It looks like unfortunate accidents. It looks like noise, until the noise becomes a pattern. And Lake Lanier has a pattern. A particularly hard set of data comes from the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, DNR, Law Enforcement Division, which tracks boating incidents, injuries, fatalities, drownings, and boating under the influence (BUI) activity. In a Lake Lanier boating statistics report covering 1994-2018, the DNR logs year-by-year totals for boating incidents, injuries, fatalities, drownings, and BUIs. That PDF doesn't read like a story. It reads like a slow accumulation, a place where, in certain years, the numbers spike and then settle, like the lake is breathing. Inhale, a holiday weekend. Exhale, a string of recoveries, and even without dramatizing it, some years are startling on paper. For example, the DNR's Lanier stats show 1999 with 8 total fatalities, alongside 11 drownings recorded in the same table's drowning column, and 55 BUIs. That right there tells you something important. This lake isn't only about bad swimmers, it's a collision of factors: water, traffic, speed, alcohol, visibility, and submerged hazards that don't exist in natural lakes in the same way. Now widen the time window. A widely cited summary of the DNR's data reports that 216 people died at Lake Lanier between 1994 and 2022. And within that number, 140 deaths were drownings, and 70 occurred in boating accidents. That's not folklore, that's a breakdown. And once you have a breakdown, you can stop asking, is the lake cursed? And start asking the real question: what conditions create so many drownings and boating deaths in the same place year after year? Lake Lanier is not a lake, it's a flooded environment. The bottom contains remnants of what existed before: timber, debris, uneven ground, and submerged structures. Even mainstream reporting repeatedly points to submerged hazards and the reservoir's underwater complexity as part of what makes Lanier dangerous. A natural lake forms over time, currents settle, hazards become known. The landscape becomes a lake's landscape. Reservoirs don't get that grace. You can have zones where the water looks calm on top but behaves differently underneath, especially around drop-offs, channels, and submerged obstacles. And then add the human factor. Because Lake Lanier isn't remote, it's not quiet, it's built to be used. Boating is a major part of the lake's identity, which means the risk profile isn't just swimming, it's propellers, wake turbulence, jet skis, crowded coves, bridges, night boating, holiday surges. And in the DNR's own statewide reporting, BUI isn't a side note. It's a category, because it happens enough to be tracked. So when you see drownings, you can't isolate them from what surrounds them. A busy recreational lake, heavy boat traffic, alcohol use on the water, and submerged hazards below it. That combination creates a very specific kind of tragedy. The tragedy that happens fast. The kind where someone says, "I'm fine," and then disappears. The kind where a fall becomes unrecoverable, not because the water is magical, but because the environment is difficult. Visibility, depth changes, and sudden disorientation. And sometimes it's even smaller than that. In 2024, Time reported on the drowning of Matthew Mayo, a 73-year-old who fell into the water after an unbolted boat seat shifted. An accident so mundane it's almost insulting. A life ended not in a storm, not in chaos, but in a moment that felt like nothing. That's the thing about Lanier's fatalities. Some are dramatic, some are absurdly ordinary, but they end the same way. Someone goes under, and the lake doesn't give them back easily. Now, there's another detail in The Guardian's reporting that matters here, because it tells you the death count isn't just large. It's concentrated. The Guardian notes that of the 700-plus deaths since 1956, a significant share occurred in the last 2 decades, reinforcing the idea that modern recreation, more visitors, more boats, more high-speed activity, doesn't dilute danger, it multiplies it. And the most important thing to understand is this: even if you strip away every supernatural claim, Lake Lanier still has one of the darkest reputations in the region, because it is both. That's not a curse, that's a formula. And formulas produce patterns. But numbers can also do something else. They can create distance. 216 deaths is easier to absorb than one person. 70 boating accidents is easier than imagining a body not resurfacing. That's why this chapter ends here, with the data, with the skeleton of the truth. Because the next chapter is where the skeleton becomes flesh, where the statistics get names, where the lake stops being a concept and becomes a moment-by-moment experience. Cold water, missing air, panic, silence, a family screaming a name across the surface while the surface stays calm. And there was one day, one July day, that forced the entire country to look directly at Lake Lanier, not as a local danger, but as a national headline. Not because it was the first tragedy, but because it revealed, in the cruelest way, how fast this lake can take someone, and how little warning it gives. But raw numbers don't explain the stories behind them, and what happened on one July day would change how the world saw this lake forever. Imagine celebrating a birthday, only to make the decision that would cost your life within minutes. This is not an isolated horror at Lake Lanier. Lake Lanier is a summer icon: summer trips, fishing poles, water sports, laughter across the water. But in the space between celebration and tragedy lie moments that families never recovered from, moments that turned ordinary days into heartbreaking headlines. This chapter moves beyond numbers into the human faces behind them, men and women, sons and fathers, whose stories didn't just appear in fatality tables, but in the grief of people who loved them. These aren't myths. These are documented events, reported by major news outlets and confirmed by authorities. In June 2025, a celebration turned into a nightmare that reverberated beyond this lake's shores. On June 14th, 27-year-old Ramon Diaz Soria jumped off a recreational boat with friends to mark a birthday. What seemed like a joyful plunge into warm water became a fatal moment. His life jacket was not properly secured, and he sank beneath the surface, never to resurface alive. Ramon's body was found the next day, recovered some 60 feet below the waterline, deep in a residential cove near Vans Tavern Park, the Georgia Department of Natural Resources confirmed. His sister, Abigail, later shared on a GoFundMe tribute how much he meant to family and friends. An energetic young man whose life ended suddenly while trying to enjoy a memorable moment with people he cared about. What makes this so chilling is not just the loss itself, but how normal the event seemed before it happened. A celebration, a splash into water that looked calm, and very quickly nothing returned. This wasn't an outlier. It was part of a decade-long pattern at a lake where drowning has been a persistent danger year after year. Earlier in 2025, tragedy struck another family when 43-year-old Dustin Valencia went missing during a solo kayaking trip on Lake Lanier. Valencia, a committed father of 5 and active triathlete, never made it back to shore, leaving his inflatable kayak and paddle behind. A worried family alerted authorities when he failed to pick up his children from school. Search teams combed coves, marshes, shoreline, and finally used sonar to scan deep water, eventually locating his body 51 feet below the surface near a cove where he was last seen. No signs of foul play were reported, and investigators treated it as a drowning incident, Another life claimed by the water here. Valencia's story abruptly transitioned from a routine outing to years of unanswered questions for his loved ones, and once again reminded the public that Lake Lanier can claim a life without warning. Lake Lanier has seen tragedies that go beyond drownings, incidents that capture wide public attention because of their dramatic scale. On July 4, 2025, the lake's 4th of July revelry turned starkly dangerous when a 23-foot cabin cruiser exploded behind Margaritaville's shoreline, injuring 7 people, including a 5-year-old child. According to official reports, 5 of the injured were hospitalized, some with 2nd and 3rd degree burns, and 1 had to be airlifted for emergency care. The cause of the blast remains under investigation, but the images of that blaze, flames towering above the water amid festive crowds, crystallize how quickly a peaceful celebration can turn catastrophic on this lake. And this wasn't a random freak occurrence. Boat fires and explosions, while less frequent than drownings, are part of the hazards of recreational boating at Lake Lanier, especially when vehicles, fuel, and large holiday crowds mix on crowded waters. One 2023 study of boating and drowning incidents across Georgia reported that by mid-2025, drownings and boating deaths were on pace to potentially exceed previous annual highs, and Lake Lanier was frequently the flashpoint in those state statistics. When you look beneath the surface of these headlines, the lake's dangers don't feel random. They reveal recurring risk factors: crowded watercraft lanes, alcohol involvement, fast-moving boats, submerged obstacles, and unpredictable underwater terrain. Not just an accident, a pattern of recurrence. Lake Lanier's fatalities may not be equally famous, like the drowning of 11-year-old Kyle Glover in 2012, which drew national attention because of his family's prominence. But each life lost echoes in the community. Kyle's tragic accident, struck while tubing and dragged by a pontoon boat, highlighted how quickly a moment of fun can become deadly. Experts and local authorities consistently point to 2 factors: submerged hazards beneath the water, remnant trees, debris, structural remnants from before the lake existed that can snare limbs or cause sudden drops, human behavior on the water, especially speed, alcohol use, and lack of life jacket discipline, which markedly increases risk. Because this is a reservoir, not a naturally formed lake, visibility can be poor, and sudden drop-offs can lurk in places swimmers and boaters don't expect. And those hidden landscapes make rescue or recovery operations far more difficult, increasing the chances that someone who goes under will never come back up. Each of these cases, Ramon, Dustin, and the 4th of July explosion survivors, represents real human loss. Parents who never saw their son again, families organizing searches across treacherous water, friends left questioning how a day of joy became one of silence. Their stories make the statistics tangible. A death is not just a figure on a chart, it's a grieving family. In every instance, the lake plays no favorites. It takes the experienced and the inexperienced alike, the swimmer and the non-swimmer, the cautious and the carefree. And because these tragedies continue to occur year after year, they compile, frame after frame, into a broader truth about Lake Lanier, not as an accident-prone backdrop, but as a stage where dangers are real, diverse, and persistent. Yet these tragedies weren't just about accidents, and there was one legend beneath the water that locals whispered with dread. Some call it haunted, some call it cursed. But what if the real horror is rooted in what's beneath the surface, and what's above it too? Lake Lanier doesn't need a ghost story to be dangerous. It already has the numbers, the headlines. The missing person searches end with sonar. And yet, people still whisper. Not in the way tourists whisper, like it's a fun scare to add flavor to a weekend trip. But in this way, locals lower their voice when they say the lake's name. Because at Lake Lanier, the danger you can measure is only half the atmosphere. The other half is the stories. And stories don't appear from nowhere. They gather where history is unresolved, and where the landscape itself hides evidence. A reservoir is a perfect hiding place. It takes land that has names and roads and boundaries, then replaces it with one smooth surface, something that looks clean, finished, harmless. But beneath that surface, Lake Lanier is still what it was. Hills, drop-offs, tree lines, foundations, old paths. The official history acknowledges that building the reservoir displaced families and required relocating cemeteries. And when you combine submerged places with a long record of deaths, folklore starts doing what it always does. It tries to explain how a place can feel alive. One of the most persistent claims you'll hear about Lanier is simple. There are cemeteries down there. That part is not purely legend. Lake Lanier's creation involved the relocation of burial grounds, and multiple sources describe cemeteries being moved as part of the reservoir project. But the folklore goes further. It says not everyone was moved. It says the lake holds graves that were missed, forgotten, or left behind. Names that were never relocated, stones that were never recovered, families that never got to say goodbye properly. You'll see that idea repeated in essays and long-form writing about the lake's reputation. The haunting isn't just spirits, it's the unsettling possibility that the flood covered over graves in a way that felt incomplete. Now, here's the important distinction. We can document that cemeteries were relocated as part of the project. We can document that the lake covers former towns and landscapes, including areas associated with Oscarville and Forsyth County's violent racial expulsion history. What we cannot do, responsibly, is present unmoved graves as confirmed fact without specific records for specific cemeteries. But folklore doesn't require perfect records. Folklore requires a feeling. And at Lanier, the feeling is reinforced by something tangible. Divers, boaters, and fishermen talk about submerged trees, underwater debris, and the way visibility can drop to nothing. Mainstream reporting about Lanier's danger routinely points to submerged hazards and the reservoir's underwater complexity as part of the risk. When people can't clearly see what's below them, the mind fills in the blank. And at Lake Lanier, the blank is large enough to swallow a town. That brings us to Oscarville. For many people, the haunting narrative starts there. A black community tied to Forsyth County's 1912 racial violence and expulsions, later submerged by the Reservoir Project, history layered under water and silence. This part is often misunderstood, even by people who think they know it. Some treat Oscarville as a ghost story setting, a town under the lake, as if the eeriness is the point. But for many, especially in black communities and those who study Forsyth's history, the lake isn't spooky, it's painful. The Guardian describes how the lake's reputation for being haunted and cursed sits alongside a darker, documented history beneath the surface, including Oscarville and the county's legacy of racial cleansing and exclusion. This is where myth and reality start to braid together. Reality: a reservoir flooded old land and structures, families were displaced, cemeteries were relocated. Reality: the area is tied to Forsyth County's 1912 expulsions and the erasure of black presence. Myth: the lake takes people because it is cursed, angry, haunted. Sometimes that myth is told carelessly, like entertainment. Sometimes it's told as grief trying to speak. Because when history is submerged, literally and culturally, people will reach for language that feels equal to the weight of it. And then there's the story almost everyone has heard, even if they don't know they've heard it. The Lady of the Lake. Depending on who tells it, she's a woman in a blue dress seen near the shore or near a bridge, appearing, vanishing, watching. Sometimes she's described as dragging people down. Sometimes she's just there, like a warning. The most common version traces back to a 1958 car accident involving two young women, Delia Mae Parker Young and Susie Roberts, who were said to have gone off a bridge into the lake. Elements of this story show up in multiple retellings, including Time's summary of the legend and the Oxford American's long-form discussion of Lanier's haunting reputation. And Atlanta Ghosts, a site focused on local hauntings, places Lady of the Lake at the center of Lanier's lore, often connected to Brown's Bridge and recurring sightings of a figure in blue near the water. Now, again, here's the line we have to hold if we want this to be unseen threads and not creepypasta. The accident is treated as the origin point for the legend in reputable long-form writing. The ghost sightings themselves are not verifiable in the same way. They are claims, reported as folklore and local testimony, not as documented evidence, but something can be unverified and still be culturally real. Because what matters is not whether a woman in blue objectively appears. What matters is why so many people want that story to be true. And the answer is uncomfortable. A ghost story gives shape to what feels shapeless. If a lake kills randomly, it's terrifying, because it means it can happen to anyone. But if a lake has a lady, a curse, a reason, then the mind can bargain with it. Don't go near that bridge at night. Don't swim after sunset. Don't disrespect the water. Folklore turns chaos into rules. And rules, true or not, feel like control. There's also a second kind of legend at Lanier that isn't supernatural, but feels like it. The something grabbed me stories. The ones whispered at cookouts and marinas. A foot caught on something unseen. A sudden pull. A panic that arrives before the brain understands why. In many cases, those stories can be explained by the reservoir's physical hazards. Submerged trees, debris, drop-offs, the confusion of cold shock, the way visibility can collapse underwater. But the point isn't to dismiss them. The point is to recognize what they reveal. People experience Lake Lanier as a place that does not behave like normal water. Even when the cause is purely physical, the sensation, being taken, being held, being pulled, translates easily into haunting. And when you combine that with the lake's history and body count, the folklore spreads almost automatically. Because what else do you call a place that keeps collecting stories like this? So here's the grounded answer to the question, haunting or hazard? It's a hazard, with the emotional afterimage of haunting. It's a reservoir built on submerged history, surrounded by modern risk, and remembered through stories because stories are how communities process what they can't fully contain. And that's why the legends matter, even when they're not true in the literal sense. Because they keep pointing back to the same thing. This place feels like it remembers. And if you think that's only superstition, then you haven't heard what some survivors say. Because there are accounts, documented on record, where people made it out alive and described something that doesn't fit neatly into boating statistics or safety bulletins. Not a ghost, not a curse, something else. But the truth was about to become even stranger, because one survivor's account would challenge everything we thought we knew about Lake Lanier.
When the world thinks they've seen the worst of Lake Lanier, someone walks out alive, and it changes everything. Lake Lanier's story isn't just written in statistics and tragedy reports. It's also written in the rare moments when someone didn't become a statistic. When a near-death experience became a first-hand account that forces us to question what this lake really is. And as surprising as those survivor stories can be, the explanations from experts, scientists, safety officials, and even the very agency that built the lake are just as revealing. In this chapter, we move past folklore and fatalities to hear voices of survival and match them with expert analysis to uncover the real complexity beneath Lake Lanier's calm surface. A 2024 Inside Edition report highlights how rare but powerful survivor accounts shape the lake's modern narrative. A new docuseries titled Surviving Lake Lanier profiles people who lived through circumstances that should have killed them. These aren't fictional scares. They're documented near-death experiences tied to the lake's genuine hazards. One diver described the underwater world as a submerged forest where trees, limbs, and debris don't decompose. When divers go below, they are literally navigating the remnants of what the land used to be before the dam, forests, foundations, and forgotten structures now frozen in the cold dark. That environment makes survival stories all the more striking. People pulled from underwater caves and drop-offs that no one expected. Swimmers who felt immediate cold shock but managed to stay afloat. Boaters who escaped sinking vessels only to drift for miles before rescue. These are not fairy tale tales. They are danger-adjacent experiences that occurred in real Lake Lanier conditions: murky water, unpredictable depths, hidden obstacles, and rapid changes in temperature and current. And while survival itself is remarkable, the consistency of these stories tells us something important. When people live through the lake, they describe it as a place that behaves far differently than they expected. That contrast between expectation and reality is where understanding has to begin. Survivors aren't the only ones giving insight. Safety officials, researchers, and scientists describe a different layer of Lake Lanier, one that doesn't require ghost stories to be unsettling. According to the environmental blog, one of the core reasons Lake Lanier is so dangerous relates directly to how it was created. The reservoir was formed by flooding existing towns, forests, cemeteries, and structures. Concrete, timber, and other debris remain on the bottom, creating hidden hazards that basic swim safety rules don't fully address. This is not speculation. It's a documented consequence of how the lake was engineered. The lake floor is uneven and unpredictable. Submerged debris and timber create entanglement risks. Water. Visibility is often poor, making hazards nearly invisible. Lake Lanier's murky water isn't just inconvenient, it's a real safety issue. Rescue teams struggle to locate missing persons because the lake's turbidity and debris scatter sonar signals and complicate underwater searches. Water temperature also plays a major role. Even in the summer, reservoirs often have cold layers beneath the sun-warmed surface. Entering these layers can trigger cold shock, a neurological reaction that can incapacitate an unsuspecting swimmer within seconds. These factors, debris, cold shock, and visibility issues, combine to produce conditions where even strong swimmers can panic, get disoriented, or become unable to reach the surface. Lake Lanier was designed and built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers as a multi-purpose reservoir intended for flood control, water supply, and recreation. According to historical Army Corps documents, such as a 2010 drowning prevention study, the lake routinely sees tens of millions of visitors annually, which predictably increases the number of incidents simply by volume. Importantly, the Corps and other agencies, including the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, have not ignored these risks. Instead, they have taken measured steps towards safety improvement. However, even these improvements have limits, because Lake Lanier is vast and visitor behavior varies widely. The Corps can advise, they can install signage, and they can partner with local safety teams, but they cannot enforce every boat operator's choices every moment of every day. That reality, that no amount of signage can fully eliminate risk in dynamic, deep water filled with unseen obstacles, is uncomfortable but central to understanding the lake's true complexity. Experts agree that Lake Lanier's danger doesn't come from a single cause. It's a synergy of factors. Reservoir lakes like Lanier aren't natural basins. They contain the literal remains of what was there before: tree trunks, houses, and roadbeds, now silent hazards for swimmers and divers. Murky water can drop visibility to just a few feet, obscuring what lies below and confusing even experienced swimmers. Sudden cold shock occurs when the surface water temperature drops sharply with depth, a physiological threat that's easy to overlook on a warm day. Lake Lanier isn't a static body of water. Dam operations cause changing currents, sometimes unexpectedly, near the dam's outflows. Alcohol, recklessness, overloaded vessels, and lack of life jackets compound the inherent environmental risks. No single factor explains every incident, but together they create a complex hazard landscape that can overwhelm even informed visitors. When you compare survivors' accounts with expert assessments, a clear pattern emerges. People exposed to sudden, unexpected conditions, cold shock, entanglement or disorientation often survive by sheer luck, quick thinking, or immediate rescue intervention. Survivors describe conditions that line up with known environmental hazards, not supernatural forces. Safety officials confirm that these same conditions, submerged debris, murky water, rapid currents, appear in incident reports repeatedly. This doesn't deliver a tidy explanation. What it does give us is something far more useful, an understanding that Lake Lanier's danger is real, explainable and multifaceted, but also unpredictable. Despite decades of data analysis and safety campaigns, there are things we still do not fully understand about Lake Lanier, why some areas are more dangerous than others, and why known hazardous areas don't always align with accident sites. Why veterans of recreational water sports sometimes succumb under conditions that seem ordinary to them. Why certain dives and recoveries become extraordinarily complicated, even for trained professionals. And while expert explanations avoid supernatural language, they often sound nearly as mysterious. Water behaves in ways that aren't always intuitive, especially in large man-made reservoirs with fluctuating levels and complex underwater terrain. This brings us to the final truth. Lake Lanier is not just a summer destination or a recreational playground. It's a complex environmental system shaped by engineering, by history, by human choices, and by natural forces that don't simplify themselves for us. The survivors remind us that one instant can change everything. The experts remind us that risk is layered, not singular, and the data reminds us that tragedy and survival are part of the same ongoing story. Lake Lanier isn't cursed. Lake Lanier isn't haunted. But it is stubbornly dangerous, a place where history, tragedy, human behavior, and still unsolved mysteries intersect. Lake Lanier is more than a summer destination. It's a testament to history, tragedy, human behavior, and mysteries still unsolved.